In this video, I want to walk you through a comparison of the most common intake manifolds for a small block Ford engine with sequential fuel injection. These are the intakes that you're most likely to find in a junkyard if you're looking to upgrade your Mustang. These are also applicable to late model Fox platform Thunderbirds, Cougars, and Lincoln Mark 7s, if they have the 5-liter motor, of course. And they should be applicable to the fuel-injected 5 liters found in Crown Victoria's, Grand Marquis, and Lincoln Town Cars. I'm going to compare all of them, show you what features each one has and what features some of them don't have. I'm not going to look at aftermarket intakes because they're expensive. The whole point of this is to look at what you can get in a junkyard and not spend a whole lot of money on it. I'm also not going to look at the intakes for 1994 and 1995 Mustangs. Those SN95 intakes have a cast-in 45-degree elbow. On an SN95, the throttle body mounts at an angle like this. That just makes them hard to use in a Foxbody. The standard 5-liter intake for an SN95 doesn't really flow any better than an HO intake of a Foxbody, and the Cobra intake for an SN95 doesn't really flow any better than an Explorer intake. Since the Explorer intake is easier to fit into a Foxbody, there's really no reason to use either variation of the SN95 intakes. I'm not going to look at truck intakes. Similar to the SN95, the shape of the upper manifold doesn't really work in a Foxbody. They have a different throttle body, they have a different throttle body location, they have different air intake tubes. For the amount of work it would be to adapt one, you'd still see more benefits buying an Explorer intake. There are two other Ford intakes I'm not going to cover. One is the 1993 Cougar intake. It is, of course, a direct fit for a Foxbody Mustang, and it flows about the same as the Explorer intakes, but it's a lot more expensive and a lot harder to find. The other intake I'm not going to cover is the tubular GT40 intake. It flows about the same as an Explorer intake, but it's a lot more expensive and a lot harder to find. Again, if you're looking at building a budget junkyard hot rod, you're better off just going with an Explorer intake. The intakes I have laid out here are a stock HO intake manifold. This is what would come on a Mustang or a Lincoln Mark 7 LSC. This particular one I pulled off a Lincoln LSC. Over here we have two different Explorer intake manifolds. This one is from a 97, I believe, or a 96. It's an early model with EGR. This is a later model. This came off of a 1999 Mercury Mountaineer, and it does not have the EGR port. Before I get into the features and issues with each intake, I just want to show you what they all look like. On the top here, that intake flow path gets very narrow, does a chicane around these bolt holes. If you look at the Explorer upper, it does much less of a chicane, and it also bottlenecks a lot less. Here they are right next to each other, and you can see just how much of a difference that is. As far as I know, the internal passages are the same on the Explorer uppers regardless of when they were made. The only major difference with the uppers is that one has EGR and one doesn't. Looking at the bottoms of the intakes, you can also see that the HO intake has a much smaller intake passage than these. It's hard to see what the actual passageway shape is, but there's a lot more space there. On the lowers, the stock HO intake has these oval-shaped ports. They're all in line, and because they're all in line, they have to squish them down a little bit into this oval shape. Looking at the Explorer lower intake, you can see that the ports are staggered, which allows them enough space to be made round. You can see that the HO passages are a lot smaller than the Explorer passages. The two Explorer intake lowers are pretty much the same functionally in terms of passing air through, again with the exception that the late model does not have EGR. The early model does have EGR. And there are a couple of casting differences that you can see here. The lower on the early model has a boss here and a boss here. The late model intake does not have a boss here, and it does not have a boss here at the far back on the passenger side. You can start to get the idea that the Explorer intake manifold is going to flow a lot better than the HO intake manifold. Now, I don't have a flow bench, so I don't have the flow bench numbers to prove that to you, but I do think it's interesting just how much of a difference you can see from the outside without measuring anything. There is a fourth manifold that I don't have out here. It's in my car right now, actually, and that is the original non-HO manifold, or the standard output manifold. Externally, it looks identical to the HO intake. The lower intake manifold actually is the same part. Now the upper manifold, when you pull this cover plaque off, you'll see that the HO manifold has HO stamped into it or cast into it. The non-HO manifold will be blank right there, it won't say anything. Just for quick reference, this is what a non-HO intake manifold looks like in a car. As you can see, it really looks the same as an HO manifold. It'll have a plaque that looks something like this instead of saying 5.0 HO on it. We've got the old 5-liter EFI plaque. Now people swap these plaques around a lot, so if you're looking at an old Mustang, there's no telling what could be under the plaque. The plaque may not be what came originally with this intake, so you really have to pull the plaque off and read the casting on the upper intake itself to tell what you're dealing with. Despite looking the same, the upper intake on an HO is supposed to flow better than the upper intake on a standard output. I have no way to prove that to you because I don't have a flow bench. However, this casting makes me inclined to believe that that's true, because if Ford thought it was necessary to denote which intake manifold was which, there must have been some other difference to them, because they wouldn't spend the money to add this if this were the same part number as a non-HO intake. If you have a Mustang and someone has an intake that looks like this that they're trying to sell you, but it doesn't say HO, I would avoid buying it, because it's likely to be more restrictive than your factory intake manifold. I've actually seen this. There's one up on eBay right now that I believe is a non-HO intake that's listed as a GT40 intake. Clearly it's not, so it's good to know what you're looking at before you just assume what someone tells you. Until you get that plaque off, there's no way to tell them apart. If you've got a Mustang, this is what your car came with from the factory. The benefit of this stock HO intake manifold for a car with an HO motor or that's being converted from standard output to HO, being that it's a factory HO manifold, it's plug and play with all the other HO stuff. The details of the HO manifold are important. This rectangular hole here is the EGR port. This is what allows exhaust gas to be recirculated back into the intake flow. All of the cars that came with the HO intake were equipped with EGR originally, and if you want your car to keep running right, it's not a bad idea to keep EGR. Some people like to delete EGR. If you do that, you really should tune the car. If you're a cheapskate like me who's doing a very mild build, you don't want to bother getting the car tuned. Now, along with the EGR, there are a couple other things to note on the lower intake manifold. One of them is this. This is the ACT, the air charge temp sensor. And it plugs into this little boss on the lower intake manifold. That's important. People try to relocate this to the air box. Some of them have success with that and some don't. I would say if you can avoid it, don't do that, because that will read a different temperature than it will here in the intake runner. The point of this is to tell the car's computer how hot the air coming in is. So if you're measuring it at the air box, you're going to get a much colder reading than you would if you were measuring it in the upper intake or down here in the lower especially. And that'll become important later on down the line with those two Explorer intakes. The other thing to note is on the back here, just spin this around, this coolant tube that goes into a threaded boss down here on the lower. This takes coolant from your EGR spacer and pipes it back down into the intake manifold and then into the engine. Again, you'll want to keep this provided that you're still running that EGR spacer. This will also be important talking about those Explorer intakes. Moving on to the two Explorer intakes, we have the early model, which was made from 96 to about mid-year 1997, and the late model, which was made from about mid-year 97 when they stopped these, all the way up through 2001. Looking at the early Explorer intake, the most obvious thing that's different is that this has an EGR port in the lower. It also has an EGR port in the upper. And on the bottom of the upper, of course, there is an EGR port. That's very important, because if you have a car that you want to keep EGR on, you need this intake. That one won't work because there's no port there, that's just metal. There's no EGR port on the front of the upper. And of course, there's no EGR on the bottom. So if you want to keep EGR and run a car without tuning it, this will be the way to go. If you've already gone down the road of EGR delete, or you plan to get the car tuned and you're going to do an EGR delete anyway, you may as well get one of these and just not run EGR. The other good thing about the early Explorer intakes with internal EGR is that they have the bosses for those two attachments I showed you earlier here. The ACT sensor would go here, and your coolant line from the EGR spacer would go here. These are not drilled or tapped, so you have to do that yourself. And if you need to know how to do that, Junkyard Doggs has a really good tutorial on it. Go look at that. When you're hunting one down in a junkyard, the early ones at least have the bosses. So you can drill this out and you can tap it. It's an NPT fitting for both. The late model intakes with external EGR do not have those bosses, which means there's really no meat to run a tap in. Guys who are running these and still want to keep their ACT sensor wind up relocating it sometimes to the upper intake or sometimes to the air box, which can have issues because the intake air at the air box will be a whole lot cooler than it is by the time it gets down to the intake manifold. With regard to the vacuum and coolant tubes on an HO intake, this is what you've got. The vacuum lines on an early Explorer intake look like this. You may notice that there are more vacuum lines here than there are on this HO intake. It's not a big deal. If you want to do the conversion, you'll just wind up capping off one or two of these. The same goes for this late model Explorer intake. Again, it's just got a few more vacuum lines than you'll need, so you'll wind up capping a couple off. If you're curious about how to do that to make one of these work in your car, you've heard me say it before, but go check out the Junkyard Doggs video. He does a really good job of it. The way the EGR works is on the underside, there is a port right here. It takes exhaust gas from the head, so a little bit of exhaust gas from each head goes up through this hole and then passes into the matching hole on the upper intake. It passes from this hole through this channel and out this little rectangular opening. This intake ordinarily would have an EGR spacer on here. It goes on like this. The way this works is that on the back side here, you can see the two mating faces. EGR gases pass from that hole into this channel, go around the outside, and then over to here. You can see there's a port there. They enter the EGR valve via this hole, are passed through the EGR valve, and then back around to this hole, and the EGR valve meters how much gas goes back through this hole and back into the intake flow. On the opposite side, you have these two coolant lines. These allow coolant to circulate through here, which is the opposite face of the EGR pass-through. What this does is it helps cool down those EGR gases as they're going back into the intake manifold. What I do want to note about these is that the late model Explorers still have EGR because the truck has to pass emissions just like anything else. The way it works is this elbow goes on the front of the manifold here. So now there is a different elbow for a non-EGR or an external EGR versus one for an internal EGR. I don't have an internal EGR elbow to show you, and I'm sorry about that. The way this EGR port works is that there's a tube on the passenger side exhaust manifold that goes up to the EGR valve, which then allows EGR gases into the intake. So instead of being an internal EGR, like the original intake or this early model Explorer where EGR gases pass through the intake manifold, this is an external EGR. Generally, the consensus is that on a tuned car, deleting EGR is a good thing because it keeps your intake air cooler. You won't be recirculating hot air into your intake. That doesn't really matter for me. I'm just a guy building a budget hot rod, and the goal here is to have a car that's very usable on the street. Keeping it closer to stock ensures that parts are easy to find. I have to do minimal work to get the car to run right, and I don't have to worry about spending the money and time to tune the car. Some people are convinced that you absolutely have to keep the coolant lines functional. Other people are convinced that you absolutely have to cap them off for maximum performance. You can do your own research on that, but my take is that if you are running EGR still, you should probably just keep the coolant lines, because if you can cool down the EGR gases, that is something you want to do. If you have an EGR delete, then there's probably no point in having coolant pass through here, so you might cap them off. You could leave them. It's just two little tubes. Like, it's really not a big deal to keep those on there. When you walk up to these in a yard, you'll be looking at them in this orientation. Looking at them from the outside, it can be a little hard to tell which one is which if you don't know the year of the truck you're looking at. Generally, if you know the year of the truck you're looking at, you'll know which one is which, but if you were looking at a 1997 Explorer or Mountaineer, it could have either one of these two intakes, and you need to know which one it is before you put the effort into pulling it. The easiest way to tell is that on the non-EGR here, there's this big notch, and on the EGR, there's no notch. It's filled in. You're going to have a hard time finding this boss because it's hidden by the coil pack and by the driver's side of the intake manifold. If you're looking for this, you're going to have a really bad time because it's usually hidden under all these other coolant lines. So the easiest tell is to look for a filled-in intake or a notched intake, depending on which one you want. Filled-in is EGR, notched is non-EGR. Both of these intakes run the same upper intake plaque. Looks about like this. It only has 2 bolts. So the original Mustang plaques have 4 bolts. There's a hole at each corner. There are 4 Torx head screws. It's a Torx T20. You can see here on this HO manifold, there are 4 bolt holes instead of just 2. This is the original design, and luckily someone else pulled the intake plaque off before I got to it in the junkyard, and they didn't shear any of the bolts. So whatever black magic they used to do that without any issues was great for me, because it means that I don't have to clean these up. I've been having trouble with my bolts. I got 2 of them out and 2 of them are still stuck, so working on that. When you're looking at one of these in the yard, oftentimes these holes will look like they have bolts in them, because if you look at a clean one here, Ford cast in a little bump that looks like a bolt. They actually did this specifically to cause junkyard mechanics pain. It's not a bolt. I spent a few minutes trying to clean dirt out of this hole, thinking that I needed to clean it out to be able to get a wrench into the splines on the Torx, only to find out that it wasn't even a bolt to begin with. These are the hardest bolts you will ever take out in your life, unless you're really lucky. When I pulled this intake manifold, it was from a relatively low mileage truck. Only had 150,000 miles on it, and the bolts came out like nothing. Most of the trucks you see in a yard are more like this. You're going to wind up breaking a corner of the intake plaque off trying to get to these upper intake bolts. You have to pull the cover plate off to get to them. You can see that the Torx bit stripped off in this one, and here the head sheared off the bolt. So these are not fun to take off a high mileage car. Most of the Explorers I find in yards around here have about 300,000 miles on them, give or take. The highest I've seen, I think, was 345 or so. The lowest I've seen was 150,000, like this guy. Most of them are going to have about 300,000 on them, which means that these bolts will have been heat cycled a lot and they'll be very corroded. It's a steel bolt that goes into an aluminum part, and by the time it gets heat cycled a bajillion times on top of an engine, it will be bimetallically corroded in place. If you're lucky, these 2 bolts will come out nice and clean and look like this. This is a beautiful sight. These bolts that go in here, or they're actually studs, I should say, they're usually pretty healthy. Again, they look pretty good on that one too. These are long bolts that look like this. They're about the same as those, but a little tiny bit shorter. Those usually come out okay. What you have to watch out for is these bolts, which sometimes will like to shear off, though they usually behave pretty well. And then the killers are the lower intake bolts. These back 2 in particular are really, really hard to deal with. If you're lucky, they'll come out looking something like this, you know, kind of gross, but it came out in one piece. Or like this, where there's some carbon buildup starting on it. If you're not lucky, they'll come out like this and just shear off, which is fine if you don't want the engine block. If you're really unlucky, you'll shear the head off and be left with this whole shank of the bolt still in the hole that you then have to pry the intake up over. And when they get corroded in place, that's not fun. I had to do that on this one, and it was a very, very long day standing out there in 90 degrees trying to get that thing out of the car. On these HO intake manifolds, the studs that go through the throttle body and the intake spacer into the intake can be pretty bad. I was able to get 3 of them out. All 3 required the jam nut technique, where you put 2 of the nuts back on and turn them, and you can see just how rusty these get. See how it's got a waist there where it's getting thin? Now this one, I couldn't get out all the way. I wound up getting the other 3 out and then just spinning the whole intake spacer around the stud to get it out. It's still stuck in the intake spacer. So I've been soaking it in penetrating oil and hoping that someday I'll be able to get it out. Now, I don't want to go into it in this video, but at some point when I go to put this intake on my car, I'll probably try to make a video showing what to change, what connects to what on the car, how all the vacuum lines work, what to cap off, what to keep using. If you have any more curiosity about adapting an Explorer intake like one of these 2 to fit your car, go check out the Junkyard Doggs YouTube channel. He's got a really good comprehensive guide to the differences between the two and what you have to do to make them work on a Mustang. If you're curious about the flow bench numbers or about the performance of each intake, the numbers should all be out there. I know there are some numbers out there for the Explorer intakes, and of course Richard Holdener's channel has a whole bunch of stuff comparing different intakes, and at some point both of these go up on the dyno for comparison. If you haven't seen his channel, I'd recommend checking it out. Pretty useful channel, lots of really good information, and lots of numbers to back up the things that he says. Hopefully this was helpful to somebody. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the comment section. I may not know the answer, but at least I can tell you that I don't know, and then maybe be able to refer you to some other web page that does have better information. In this video, so bad at speaking.